Okay, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome you to this second webinar that ISD is hosting around the topic of gender equality in agriculture in the wake of Women Delivered Conference 2019 that took place in Vancouver earlier this month. This is the second webinar that we are holding to present the key findings on the subject of women's rights to land and productive agricultural resources addressed in a recent ISD publication called Leveraging Voluntary Sustainability Standards for Gender Equality and Women Empowerment in Agriculture that has been possible thanks to the support of IDRC, the Government of Canada, and you can access in our website. Thanks for being with us today. We have approximately around 100 participants to this webinar. My name is Cristina Larrea, and I am the lead of the Sustainability Standards Program at ISD, and it's my pleasure to moderate the discussion with the author of this report, Kathleen Sexsmith. Good morning, Kathleen. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good morning.
Excellent. So Kathleen is here with us today, and she is an assistant professor of rural sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at Penn State University in the U.S. Her academic and policy research agenda examines gender roles and identities in agricultural work among immigrant farm workers in North America and smallholder farmers in Central America and in Mexico. She has written research papers on sustainability standards and provided guidance on an on and off basis to ISD on how to address gender issues in the voluntary sustainability standards and other programs. She is the author of the 2017 ISD research report that the current guidebook builds on, which is called Promoting Gender Equality in Foreign Agricultural Investments, Lessons from Voluntary Sustainability Standards. So thank you for being with us today, Kathleen, before the summer break, and then we will move to the webinar. We have a 30-minute webinar today, so let's kick off. I would like to briefly go through the agenda before we kick off. We will start with some introductory facts about women and land tenure, access to land, and why this subject is important to advance sustainable development. We will move then to explore with Kathy how standards can be leveraged to promote women's rights to land and productive resources based on existing evidence and Kathy's knowledge and expertise in this subject. Following this discussion, we will move to the question and answer section with all of you. As a housekeeping note, as participant, you can write your questions in the Q&A chat on the bottom of your screen. If you can identify yourself with your name, I will address the questions directly to Kathy. So let's start addressing this interesting topic on women's land to rights. Okay. So, Kathy, could you give us some quick facts on where do we stand on women's rights to land and access to productive resources, and explain why this subject is relevant for sustainable development?
Sure. Well, according to UN Women and the FAO that have done systematic research in the area, women continue to face systematic discrimination in their access to land across the Global South. And so one estimate is that globally, women own approximately only 12.8% of agriculturally productive land. So a main concern here is that even in countries that provide for gender equality in access to land and ownership of land, those laws are often undermined at the local level by customary land laws. So there are examples of this from around the world. Basically, these are sort of traditional systems in local communities that often work against women's interests in the sense of not being able to inherit land from a father or when a spouse dies, and other ways that women are impeded from getting equal access to land by sort of local custom. So this is a critical concern, and even when women do own land, they often have poorer quality land for agricultural production, or it's inconvenient sort of in marginal areas far from where they live. So this is a critical concern because their lack of access to land also affects women's access to other productive inputs for agriculture. So for example, it's extremely difficult to get access to credit for agricultural production if you don't have a land title for collateral with the bank. It's also extremely difficult to be recognized as a farmer and get equal access to extension services if you're not seen as a formal landholder. And so there's an excellent FAO report, which perhaps many people have already seen, published in 2011, on the gender gap in agriculture. And it looks at this theme in great depth. And they argue that the consequences of gender inequalities in land and productive inputs are very serious because women farmers are currently producing 20 to 30% less food than they could if they had the same access to land and productive resources as men. And so the FAO calculates that total agricultural production in the global south could rise by as much as 4%, which would lift 150 million people out of hunger if that gender gap were closed. So it's a serious issue.
Very, very interesting. This information that you're giving us. Yeah.
So it's also important to know that women's land rights concerns are becoming well recognized. And so, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is sort of the conceptual basis for the guidebook, addresses women's right to land and productive inputs in several of its main goals and targets. So Sustainable Development Goal 1 and poverty has a target, number 1.4, that provides for access to and ownership and control over land and other forms of property for all women and men. SDG 2, Zero Hunger, is specifically concerned with agricultural productivity of small-scale producers, and in particular women, family farmers, and other marginal groups, and is concerned with ensuring their equal access to land and other productive resources. And then SDG 5, which is gender equality, also talks about the need to undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, which include land. So this is a concern that's explicitly mentioned in 3 different places in the Global Community's Sustainable Development Goals.
Very interesting. So basically, it's an important issue for the whole development community, and it's a challenging issue to address because, as you mentioned, there is a need to transform, visions, norms, value, legal frameworks, as well as customary rights. So how in this challenging process, how standards and development organizations working on the ground on certification and working directly with women, with farmers, with rural communities can address this issue?
Yeah, so standards have begun to address this issue in several different ways, both directly and indirectly through their implementation. There are some impacts on women's right to land. And so to start with the direct ways that they address it, some standards include criteria related to this issue. And so one thing that's important to note is that for the research that was done for this publication, the research was done in 2018, none of the standards analyzed, which included the 4 Cs for the coffee community, fair trade standards for small producers and hired labor, the iPhone principles for organic production, Rainforest Alliance, and the UTS group and individual certifications, because at that time those were separate standards. Now they have joined or in the process of joining. But a review of all of those different standards showed that none of them actually had an explicit criteria that said that they were going to work on promoting women's equal rights or women's rights to land directly in any way. But they do address access to productive inputs, which is a related concern. And so they provide, for example, all of them address equitable access to productive resources and equitable access to agricultural trainings. And 2 of them, the 4 Cs and the Fair Trade Hired Labor Standard, were explicit about having a provision for no gender discrimination in agricultural trainings. So Fair Trade International has basically a requirement that within 3 years, there must be no gender discrimination in access to agricultural training. But it is important to note that none of these explicitly call for promoting women's land rights.
Very good.
So basically, this is something that they need to focus on. Obviously it's a very complex issue to think through the relationship between a voluntary certification system and customary law and formal law with respect to land. But it is something that is an area of concern because when women don't have secure land tenure, they get excluded from the benefits of certification. So these include things like knowledge about sustainable farming practices, income increases that are associated with certification, and the related benefits for families. So lots of research has shown that women are likely to spend their money on improvements to nutrition, education for their children, and so their lack of land rights is excluding them in many cases from the ability to gain these benefits from certification. But this is important, there are indirect ways that standards sometimes contribute to women's land rights. So one way they do this is by the requirement for the landowner to be present for the audit, because most standards require an inspection process, and it's usually an annual inspection. And they require the landholder to be present to answer questions from the auditor. And so there has been some research, mostly from southeastern Mexico, that has shown that when the outmigration of male landowners is high, that women coffee farmers ended up gaining more access to land. And so in one study, they found that the proportion of women coffee producers rose from 10% in 1999 to 35% 6 years later, simply because the men had left or temporarily left the community, and the women had to become the legal owners of the land in order for the certification process to proceed. And so that's sort of an indirect impact, but that may, at least temporarily, the research doesn't look at the long term, but at least temporarily promote women's land rights. Another way they do this is through basically the gender focused standards. And so not the ones reviewed for the guidebook, but some of the other smaller programs like the Manos de Mujer, which is cooperative in Guatemala, markets coffee as women's coffee and requires the women involved to own or manage the land to participate. And so that would be sort of indirectly to gain access to the certification process, those women would have to own or manage their land. And then also it's worthwhile thinking through some of the other impacts of standards. So the guidebook talks about the different ways that women are empowered through certification. And so through different forms of empowerment at the family and community level, we might, think optimistically about the longer term benefits.
Excellent.
Yeah. And so one thing that is a concern that the literature has documented extensively is that women do tend to have less access to information about certification and information about production than men do, and that standards can inadvertently reinforce these inequalities. So for example, when women don't have land, they tend to depend on men for information about certified production. And so that reinforces their sort of reliance on men rather than promoting their empowerment. And also, it can limit their knowledge of the certification process, the benefits of certification, and how it works. And that's because both of their lack of land rights, but also an extenuating consequence is that they don't get as much access to information, both from extension providers, but also through cooperatives that are often the main source of information about sustainable production. And so if they're not equally recognized as landholders, they're not as likely to be equally recognized as active and productive members within a farmers cooperative, and that can create a bias against women in getting access to information about production and certification. But the good thing is we like to think optimistically and look at all the many impacts and potential benefits of standards for smallholders. And there is evidence that this knowledge gap or gender disparity in knowledge can be reversed when there's specific outreach to women. So, for example, there was an UTS and Fair Trade Certified Cooperative in Uganda where a study was done, and the farmers told the researchers that the women had better access to agronomic information and training thanks to the certification process, thanks to a direct outreach to women. And other things that the cooperatives can do to reverse this knowledge gap is to basically dedicate funds to women's training, to inputs, productive inputs, and to access to credit. And so through the use of funds in this way, women can receive the same benefits that men often receive through the cooperative.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So actually, it's an structural issue, women's rights to land and the standards. Even though they are not addressing directly or advocating directly, they can leverage their existing capacities, as you have explained in these examples, as well as the one in Guatemala, where there was increased migration of men and women take a leading role, and there were important benefits or results out of that. So they can leverage their existing capacities alongside the development organizations working on the ground to address probably more directly, or to advocate more directly women's right to land. So based on your research and experience as gender specialist, what would you recommend to standards and development organizations working on certification on the ground to promote women's land rights and access to productive resources?
Yeah, there's several different things they can do. They can work very actively in terms of promoting and advocating for women's more stable and secure rights to land, in coordination with different efforts to support certification. And so they can make that sort of a critical aspect in their efforts to promote certification. They can also advocate for better improved land rights for women with local governments. Development organizations who are working in this area, for example, they can do things to make their extension services more gender equitable. So oftentimes you see that women don't have the same access to extension services as men do, because extension agents are usually men. And there might be sort of local norms that make it inappropriate for a woman to be interacting alone with a man in the field. And so development organizations and extension agencies can train and hire more female extension workers to sort of remedy this knowledge gap, specifically around certification. They can also promote women's participation in trainings about certification. And so I think sometimes agencies that promote standards and standards bodies, they provide trainings, but they might not always be aware that men are far more likely to attend than women due to different sort of cultural norms, due to the fact that women have a heavy labor burden, including childcare responsibilities in the home, that make it difficult for them to leave to go to trainings. So these agencies that work with them can make efforts to provide childcare at such trainings, and specifically reach out to women to invite them to learn about certification and its benefits. They can promote women's rights to productive agricultural resources when they take on women's empowerment projects. So, for example, rather than just having a project that perhaps promotes women's production of artisanal crafts or non-agricultural related work, they can develop projects that specifically focus on these issues. Potentially using the development funds that sometimes come along with certifications. And then they can promote specific agricultural activities that benefit women farmers. So for example, certain forms of intercropping, such as banana or other shade trees, might provide commodities that women can sell and promote their access to market, and sort of promote their role as productive agricultural participants as well.
Mm. Excellent, Kathy. So basically, the research that you have done and the information that we can find in the paper, proposes different set of recommendations. Some are more practical, tactical within the outreach of the standards and organizations working with farmers. At the community level, like the trainings, like the focus-related projects to women, or the use of female extension services, and others are more structural that require collaboration, and integration in larger scale initiatives, like the first recommendations: promote and advocate for women's more stable and secure rights to land. And I would like to provide a couple of examples of initiatives that have been identified in the Women Deliver Conference. Like, for instance, there is an important land policy initiative in sub-Saharan Africa that aims to transform, the existing legal frameworks that regulate land ownership to favor women, and is led by the African Union Commission, African Development Bank, and the United Nations Commission on Africa. So it's an important initiative already being there. And also there is one global campaign on women land rights, led by the organization Landensa across different countries. So that could be examples through which development organizations and standards can join efforts to advocate for land rights. Do you identify any other example or any other way these recommendations can be implemented?
One thing that has become very or is gaining popularity in the development community, and that has been shown to work effectively, is an approach called the gender transformative approach. And so there are several major donors and NGOs that have adopted this way of doing their work with small-scale farmers. But basically, it's an approach that looks at the structures and the norms and the individual forms of agency that all work together to produce gender discrimination against women in a local community. And they work with both women and men to try to remedy this. So it's an approach that recognizes the structural forms of discrimination that you're talking about, but also sort of the local cultural practices that are often detrimental for women. And usually it involves sort of sitting down with both women and men and doing sort of exercises that help families and communities to identify different forms of inequality and the potential damage that they create, and to develop sort of ways of addressing them. And so it's a very sort of local level approach that helps people think about culture and the broader systemic forces that create gender inequalities as well.
Excellent. I think that's a good suggestion also, and working in parallel with men and women together to understand these structural reasons behind these gender inequalities, how to transform them. And as an example of that, I would like also to mention the process that Rwanda has led in at different scales, from rural communities, family, household to governments, just to trying to train women and speak to women about their importance of being landowners. So basically raising awareness with the men, but also with the women directly about the importance of being landowners. That was key, in order to transform, existing norms. And at the moment, I think is one of the initiatives that Rwanda took the lead on. And as you might know, in the audience, Rwanda has relevant frameworks and legal systems that respect and promote women lands rights. So very, very well. Thank you, Kathy, for all of these recommendations and examples. We have a few minutes to go for Q&A. So let's go. I'm going to open my questions here. I think. Okay, can we please? Okay, yeah, there is a very practical question. Can we please get a link to the recording after the webinar? Yes, for sure. We're going to share all the link to the webinar to all participants. We don't have an updated question. Does anybody want to ask a particular question? It would be great. Otherwise, I can ask Kathy a question. Kathy, as you mentioned during the webinar, there is this dialogue between, legal frameworks and customary rights standards. As you propose in one of the, you mentioned in one of the slides, the one of the criteria is to, respect customary rights. How these, these criteria, how this respect can, interact and can be addressed, to transform, land rights, women land rights?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question. I think you went right to the heart of the most difficult and interesting thing. Um, I think that's sort of something that we have to be aware of and cautious about is that standards are voluntary instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the difficulties about women's land rights are related to very specific workings of federal governments and of local custom, which often overrides federal law. And so standards are simply a global template and sort of create a vision for sustainability and social equity. But that template is sometimes difficult to match onto local realities and local regulations and local practices, which vary widely. And so I'm not sure there's sort of an easy answer to this, how to make it all work together, all those different pieces of the puzzle, other than perhaps to recommend that the standards bodies recognize this. I'm sure they have, and that's probably why the women's land rights is not there, because it's a very difficult political and social issue. And so I think the best that they can do is to advocate for women's land rights and continue to build the evidence base about the importance of providing women equal rights to land to benefit from certification.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when they have these positive results, they can leverage these capacities and best practices, try to influence how standards are being, or how certification is being endorsed in different contexts across the developing world. Excellent, very good. So I think we are about to finalize this webinar, because it's at the moment of 10:30.
Sure.
So thank you, Kathy, very much for sharing with us your knowledge, your expertise, and the findings of this research that everybody can find in our website. And happy to engage with you in another time. And thank you all of you who have been attending this webinar. And we will share the discussion and the link to the recording shortly. Thank you so much, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.